the business story is, the science behind storytelling, and the most important story for every salesperson. My guest today is Mike Adams. Welcome, Mike.
Thanks, Mustafa.
How are you today?
Going very well. Early in the morning for me in Hobart, Tasmania.
Love it, love it. Let me do the proper introduction to Mike, and we're going to dive into a very interesting conversation about storytelling, which is near and dear to my heart, and it's very important for your business if you want to make your sales and marketing much easier and much less salesy, as a matter of fact. So, engineer turned salesman Mike taught himself storytelling while selling and managing sales teams throughout the world for international corporations such as Schlumberger, Siemens, Nokia, Halliburton, and Motorola. With each industry change landing him on the wrong side of a steep learning curve, Mike learned to seek out and share specific, persuasive stories. He published 7 stories every salesperson must tell in 2018, and today he leads a sales storytelling consulting practice where he has delivered sales story programs for global corporations like Nokia, Meta, SAP, Rolls-Royce, and many other well-known global brands. Mike, welcome again.
Thanks, Mustafa. Lovely to be here.
I guess it's super early in the morning for you.
It's not too bad. Just 7:30.
All right. It's like tomorrow. You're already in tomorrow.
Yeah, 7:30 tomorrow. I'm ahead of you.
Yeah, we are yesterday.
You guys are yesterday.
We need to catch up. So, Mike, let's dive into it. What is your story?
Well, I have lots of stories. And all of us do in sales. We have lots of stories. But I'll tell you the story that I would use to introduce myself to a prospect, or a training course. If I'm teaching as well, a version of this kind of story. So I call this a connection story. It's a story that's designed to connect me to my audience, and most importantly, if your audience only get one point out of this session today, it's an opportunity for me to hear the story of my prospect. So I'm going to tell this story to my prospect or my client. I'm going to say, what about you? And this is a beautiful thing about storytelling. We tell a story to hear a story. And salespeople need to learn that it's really important to hear the story that the client is going to tell them. So you started my story for me. So back in 2015, I was at the end of being a good corporate citizen. I don't know if you've worked in large corporations, but they wear you out eventually because you have to put your mind in various states of disbelief to work in a big corporation. So I decided that I would set up consulting practice. I had a couple of colleagues here in Australia and see if I could solve the largest problem that I had as a sales leader. I've been running really big sales teams all over the world. I'm very fortunate to have lived in 9 different countries around the world. And the biggest problem I had, the number one problem, I characterized as how to get salespeople to say the right thing. And by that, don't just mean the right thing in a conversation to influence a prospect. I mean the right ethical thing and the right thing to actually help their client. And I'd spent lots and lots of times with many salespeople in client conversations where I'm trying to kick them under the table because they're saying the wrong thing. They're jumping in too early with their solutions and their products and all the rest of it. They're not connecting properly with the client. They're not listening. They're not being helpful. So that was my intention. That's actually a pretty big project. I was pretty successful in terms of selling training programs around, saying the right thing, conversation skills. But after because I'm an engineer by training, I like to be very specific about what works and what doesn't and why it works. I decided to interview all the people that I trained. It was more than 100. And I had a very fixed list of questions. I was particularly interested in retention. So what I discovered going through this list was that salespeople remember pretty much nothing from a sales training course. They would tell me things that I hadn't taught them, or completely the wrong thing. But what I noticed was that they did remember many of the stories that I'd used in the training. And it was a light bulb moment. It was like I'd always used stories, and like you, I'd known that stories were important, but I hadn't really focused entirely on story as the way to teach salespeople and to help them with that thing, how to say the right thing. And that was a big switch. So we've just reorganized all the training. We're just going to teach story, and the results are amazing because salespeople do remember what you teach them when you just focus on stories, because stories are inherently memorable, and we might get into that. So that was what I did. I joined a company called Anecdote in 2019, which is a global storytelling business. Built the sales part of that business with them. Still deliver with them, but I've mostly these days moved away from just training to focusing on helping mostly large corporations build a story bank, because it's my belief that the system of collecting your most powerful team stories for sales leaders is the most important thing a sales leader can do. If you can construct a story bank, you can bring in new salespeople. They very quickly get up to speed. They know what to say. They know the culture of your sales team. They know how to behave, because those are also important stories. We call those value stories. So that's more what I do these days is build story banks, help my clients build their own story banks. Training comes along for the ride. They have to learn how to tell stories there, but that's not the most important thing. The most important thing is having a system to sell. So that's the story that I would tell.
I love it. I love how you talked about getting salespeople to sell and talk with stories versus just, I guess, talking about a pitch, how awesome I am, here's my great product, pay me type of approach, right? Yeah. I love it. We're gonna, I guess, dig into that. So I know we touched on it already a little bit, but tell us about what you do these days and who you serve.
Sure. So these days I have a sailboat, and I spend a lot of time sailing that. As I'm just about to sail up the east coast of Australia. I have a large catamaran, so I do that. But I recently purchased Starlink satellite, so I do my training from my boat as well. So I was in the very southern tip of Tasmania, in a place that you cannot drive to. It's in the Southwest National Park. The only way to get there is to either walk there or sail there, or you can fly if you want to go into a little airstrip. And I did a coaching session for one of my clients in London. That was Rolls-Royce. Actually, you already mentioned them. And with perfect connectivity in a howling gale off the southern tip of Tasmania on my boat. So but that's what I do. The program that I do, that particular program's a training program leading to building a story bank. And it has some face-to-face sessions early on, but then, we need routine coaching to get skills like storytelling, which take a lifetime really to master. You need coaching. People need an opportunity to practice. And actually, we culminate in a special event called a story competition. It's a team competition. We have groups of 3 or 4 in the client, like my client. So that's Rolls-Royce. They're working on an opportunity, and they will develop different types of stories, connection stories, success stories, other types that we'll probably talk about today. And they will deliver those stories as if they are in a client conversation. And they compete against each other. We give a prize. We invite the CEO and senior leaders to come along and witness that. So it's like the culmination of their training, but also it's the event that creates the story bank. So those stories, because they work on them really hard, they spend a lot of time practicing, they become the stories for the story bank. Yeah, so maybe that gives you a little bit of an idea of what I do.
Love it. I've done some studies and some work on storytelling, and it kind of changed my perspective. I guess we got to dig into that. But how did you get into stories specifically? What's the story there?
Sure. So I was working in England, as a marketing manager. I spent most of my career in sales and sales leadership, but I had a short stint as a marketing manager in England for a software company. It's a very large technology company that focuses on the oil and gas industry, software for the oil and gas industry. And you should know a bit about that, based in Calgary. So anyway, I was working in London and I got this job. Mike, I just started the job. We're going to do a big customer event, 300 of our customers in Prague in the Czech Republic. You have 1 hour to present our new software system. And our new software system was this fancy new thing that integrated software for very many disciplines in the oil and gas technical area. And I was new to marketing, but I knew that 1 hour of just a software demonstration was going to be very boring. So I decided to write a play about how to use this software. And I went to my team. I had about 6 people working for me. I said, we're gonna act out the parts in this play. And they were appalled. I had this German reservoir engineer. He said, Mike, I'm not acting. I quit if you make me act, on the stage. And anyway, I convinced these guys to act out this play. So I had an office set up on the stage. I had big screens behind them, and had this drama going on in an oil field, things that were going wrong, and they were using this new software to solve the drama, right? And we got to the end. I had 45 minutes for the play, and then I had a few minutes for questions. And at the end of this, the questions went for more than an hour. And my guys stayed in character to answer the questions, right? The customers were so interested in how they were solving a problem that they recognized with the software. It was nothing about the software. It had no features or benefits. It was, how do you solve these problems in this sort of scenario? And that was the clue to me that the story was much more interesting than the features of the product. But obviously 45 minutes and writing a play was extremely difficult. And not long after that, I was transferred to Russia. I went to Moscow with my family. And I had heard a very interesting story about my company. The company is called SLB these days, used to be called Schlumberger. And my company had started in Russia in the late 1920s and been nationalized by Stalin, kicked out of Russia. It was a very interesting story. And at that time, when I was there, which was the year 2000, Russian oil company people didn't know Schlumberger. It's a very famous company in the West, but in Russia, the Soviet Union, they'd never heard of my company. And so I was telling this story. I was telling the story about what happened to Schlumberger in Russia. And I told one client one day, and I visited another client the next day in Moscow. And they told me my story. And I was like, oh, really? Shit, that's interesting. My story has traveled from that client to this client. And that's when I really appreciated the power of a short story. And I can tell you the story that I told them if that's interesting to you, because it's a type of story that we call a company story. And most salespeople don't know their company story, or they kind of assume that the client understands their company.
Yeah.
And even if it's a very famous company, like, I work with very big companies, like you mentioned, the client can assume they understand your company, but they probably don't. And so telling your company story is another way to connect. So Schlumberger, this is the story I told. So Schlumberger, now called SLB, it's a very famous company in the oil and gas industry, started in the 1920s. 2 brothers in Alsace. The correct pronunciation would be Schlumberger. It's a German name from the French-German border. And these guys were physicists and engineers, and they invented a technique to locate where oil is in an oil well. So they lowered electrodes in an oil well, and by measuring the resistance, they could figure out where the oil is in an oil well. And that's a $1 trillion invention. That's made so much money, that invention, and the company that was built on that, because until then, you drill a hole in the ground and you don't know where the oil actually is, right? So the very first part of the world that these brothers took this entrepreneurial company was the former Soviet Union. So they were working in Georgia, the southern republics of the former Soviet Union, and they got nationalized by Stalin in the early 1930s. So they got kicked out. Their country manager was actually executed. I didn't tell my Russian clients that, but all of the equipment stolen. And fortunately, they also just started up in Texas, and so the company didn't break the company. They got going in Texas, but it was a very rough start for an entrepreneurial company. And then fast forward to the 1990s when the Soviet Union broke up and Russia was opening up to Western companies for the first time in 70 years. Schlumberger had to make a decision: do we go back in to Russia or not? And the strategy guys took a business case to the CEOs, Ewan Baird at the time, and said, what do you think? How much money are you willing to lose to get back into Russia, was the question they asked him. And he said 200 million US. And so they said, well, this is the plan. We're going to take two of these newly privatized Russian companies. It was really the Russian state oil company that was just chopped up into tiny oil companies. In fact, two of them, we're going to take our technology in, we're going to put our people in, and we're going to show them how Western technology can improve their business. That was the strategy. And they took those two companies, doubled their business in 18 months. So the whole Russian oil industry was going like this, and two companies went like this. And today the business in Russia is more than $2 billion business per annum.
That's their first
I'm
Schlumberger.
I'm not sure it is exactly today with Ukraine, but it was by the time they got to about 2010. So that's the story I was telling, and that you can imagine the impact of that story, I suspect, on Russian oil company execs. And I ask Western salespeople what they think Russian oil companies would infer from that story. What would a Russian oil exec infer from my story? What do you think?
I think they would like it. I mean, I would be like, oh, can you do that for us?
Exactly. It's interesting that you say that, because a lot of people don't pick that up. What they infer is, Schlumberger is going to make me rich. That's what they infer, right? Because you doubled the production of these companies, and you have this long history of technology, and you're willing to invest in our country. That willingness to invest is huge, right? So that little story, which you can tell in 2 minutes, was enormously powerful. That we doubled our software business in 18 months in Russia using that story.
Love it. Love it. So let's talk about some mechanics of the story. What actually is a business story?
Yeah, well, what is a story to start off with? A lot of people don't know what a story is exactly. And we know this for sure, because you very often see, business articles about storytelling, and there isn't a single story in the whole article. So that tells me the guy who wrote this story, usually from some big consulting company, doesn't know what a story is. It's very common. So that's the most important thing to understand. A story has to be a sequence of events. Now, if you're in Hollywood, you might start that sequence at the end and go backwards. But in general, it starts at the beginning in a time and place, and sequentially goes through something that happened. And I only teach salespeople to tell true stories about things that actually happened. It's extremely dangerous to allow your salespeople to make up stories. I highly recommend you never do it, because memorable stories travel. And we can talk about this. I can tell you about some experiences of making up stories. It's really bad news for your company, because a good story travels. Someone's going to notice that it's not true, and your reputation is shot to pieces.
Yeah.
So a story is a sequence of events that happen in a time and place. So true stories happen in a true setting at a true time, and they just tell your customer what happened. The opposite of storytelling is abstraction. We take a story and we generalize it, and then we generalize it up to an abstraction, like we believe in customer service, or our product is fantastic and it's the leading product in this category. Those are abstractions. They're not stories. They're abstractions from stories. Everything we learn, everything in our mind is built through stories, but we tend to abstract. And in business conversation, we love to talk abstractly. We talk very abstractly. We sound smart. We sound very clever. No one knows what we mean exactly unless they're completely in on the abstract language. They really understand our abstract language, but they don't. But they don't understand it because we work in our company. We learn a language as the vendor, and we tend to use that language to the clients, and they don't understand us. They don't like to say they don't understand us because people don't. And so they get half an idea of what we're talking about, but they don't really understand. When we tell a story, they can understand. Now, you asked me about what's a business story, and a business story is only one special thing on top of a normal story, which is it makes a relevant business point. A business story makes a relevant business story. Otherwise, it's time wasting, or it might be just entertaining. But if we're talking with serious business leaders, and I hope that your audience are talking with serious business leaders, they don't want their time wasted. That's the number one way that stories can go wrong, is you're not telling a relevant business point. And the way to be sure that your client will listen to your story is to tell them the point at the beginning. You say, I would like to make a point about the importance of having your own company story. Let me tell you what happened to me in Russia back in the year 2000. And at the end of it, you can say, so you see, all your salespeople need to know how to tell your company story.
Love it.
So you make your point, you ahead of time, you tell your story, you re-emphasize your point. And that's what a business story is. A business story is a way of making your point, a way of being understood, so that you can ask your client, what about you? What's going on here? What's happening here? And then you start to hear your client's story.
Love it. So we talked about your story, what a story and a business story is. And my next question is, why should businesses and salespeople care about stories? Yeah. I mean, if someone has never heard of stories, they'd be like, I have a sales pitch, I have a sales deck. It shows all the bells and whistles about my product and talks about how awesome and amazing I am.
Yeah.
Why should I even bother with stories?
Yeah. Yes, it's a good question, and obviously companies, well, it looks like companies succeed without storytelling training, doesn't it? You know, like you say, they've got their deck and they've got their sales leaders pushing and running their forecasting calls and hammering all the salespeople. Once you understand what a story is and you've had a little bit of training on how to recognize a story, what you'll notice is that the best salespeople tell stories all the time. In fact, I have a hypothesis, and it's this: there is no successful company without a storyteller. Every company that ever succeeded has a storyteller. There's a storyteller behind that success. Steve Jobs is a classic example for Apple. Mm-hmm. And he taught himself storytelling. Steve Jobs was not a good storyteller early in his career. He taught himself how to do it. And he's brilliant. He's absolutely brilliant at it. Oh, sadly no longer with us. So when you ask me, why should I do this thing? My answer is, well, if you've been successful, you're already doing it and you don't realize. Your best salespeople are already doing it. It's a kind of secret. But why should you do it methodically? Because your pitches and your decks and those things don't work. Your clients hate them. They actually shield you from a properly connected, intimate conversation with your clients. You should just throw them out and teach your salespeople to have a natural conversation using stories to be understood. So we're not going to teach you how to tell exactly the same story every time, but how to have a library of stories that can work in different situations. And the good news is every salesperson finds themselves in common situations where they can use and reuse stories that they've practiced and that they've researched. So common situations would include typical objection: your price is too high. We don't need that thing. Or misunderstandings about your product. The problem of connecting: how do I get a prospect to understand me, a stranger? How do they get to know who I am, what kind of character I am? How do I do that so that they'll tell me who they are? If you can't get to that connecting stage in a sales conversation, you really have no idea who you're talking with. You have no idea, are you talking with someone who can make a decision or who will make a decision? So we really need to make that good connection. How can I help my client overcome the fear of making a decision? Well, we can use success stories. We can talk about other clients who've been in exactly that same fearful situation and overcome it. That's like a sort of a simulation for your prospect. That's a try before you buy. They can understand how it would be for them to use your product. So there's lots of common situations that your salespeople can learn specific stories that will work time and time again. So that's why you should build a system. That's why you should build a story bank.
Love it. As you're saying it, I think if we list all of our common objections that we deal with and have a proper story structure to respond to those common objections, I think to me that's a much easier and effective way to respond to an objection versus the price is too high, and I'll be like, well, no, it's not, and they'll be like, yes, it is.
Well, salespeople have two standard ways of responding to a hard objection. I call a hard objection one that really punches you. You know, the hard objection is your company is hopeless. Your implementation time is way too long. I'm not going to use you. This is a hard objection, right? And salespeople have two common responses. The first one is to argue, very counterproductive. And the second one is to agree, even more counterproductive. In fact, that's what technical people often do. They will just agree with their client, right? So how to use a story to get the client to see that there's a different way of looking at it. So let's do an example, right? So stories are just examples. So I'll tell you an example. Sure. So one of the ways that we get large corporations to try this program that I'm running, you know, teach my salespeople storytelling and get a story bank, is we offer invitation courses. So invitation courses, send your head of sales training or send your sales leader along. We don't charge, but it's going to cost you some time and you have to build some stories. Just done virtually. And so I was running one of these it was probably about 2 years ago now, and I had the head of sales training from Schlumberger, my old company, along. I was very keen to do some work, and his name is Diego, and we got to the third session, and we're teaching how to tell stories for, we call them an influence story, but an objection story. Let's call it an objection story. How do I respond to an objection? And Diego said to me, Mike, by the way, this is one of the features of stories. You often have conversation in stories. He says, Mike, I want to build an objection story for my boss because he thinks we don't need storytelling. We've got a really good sales training program. We don't want storytelling. We don't have time for it. So of course I'm going, yeah, go for it, right? What are you going to come up with? So this is the story that Diego came up with. So he said, we'll call his boss Roberta. So he says, Roberta, I acknowledge that our sales training program is pretty good. We've developed it over decades and it's customized for our business. We love it. And I also acknowledge that we've got less money this year than last year. We're on budget cut. It's hard to investigate something new like storytelling. So we call that an acknowledgement. It's not agreeing and it's not arguing, right? It's just acknowledging the objection, right? Now we go into the story. He said, being happy with what you have reminds me of my wife and her bike, because we love to go mountain bike riding in the hill country north of Houston. He's based in Houston. And we go every weekend. And I've been on at my wife for years to upgrade her bike. And she would say, no, I love my bike. It's part of my personality. I'm not changing it. But last week we were out riding and her bike broke. The frame broke. And I said to her, I'll push your bike. You take my bike. And when we got back to the car, she said, oh my gosh, your bike is so much better than my bike. I can't believe I've been riding this old thing all this time. So now we reframe back to the objection. So the reframe is, so you see, just because you're happy with something doesn't mean it's the best thing. Storytelling could really work for us. And this story I love because it has an epilogue. And the epilogue is, we have been training the global account directors of Schlumberger based on that story. So that this worked. With one of the things that worked at least. So, that head of sales training bought into the storytelling program. Now we do that for Schlumberger.
Love it. You talked about...
You see the middle road between arguing and agreeing is showing your client there's a different way of looking at this. Not that you're wrong, but there's two ways. There are, in fact, two ways to look at almost everything. Almost all of our arguments in common society, the arguments we have at Thanksgiving with our family and all the rest of it.
Yeah.
They're all about things that have two ways to look at it. And a sign of intelligence is to be able to hold two opposing things in your mind and be able to look at things from more than one direction. And stories are a brilliant way to do that.
So, Mike, if a customer says, I feel like the price is high, would you formulate a story where I would say, look, I understand what you're saying. Here's a story of another customer who thought the price was high, and then here's what we did, and after, here's what they like. Mustafa, you should have charged double for this. Would you formulate a story like that?
There's actually a number of ways that you can go with an objection like that. So you can tell the story of another client who really thought exactly the same thing, but got a fantastic return on investment. Or you can do what I did in my example, which is really pass the feeling of what it feels like to be stuck. Like that, we don't need story, we don't need this new thing, but what does it feel like to miss out on something that's new and that would really help you? So that was the example I gave with the bike story. We actually had a client tell a story. Oh, this wasn't a training course that I ran. It was one of my business colleagues, but we were running for a software company in Germany. And the sales director there was, the objection was, you're way too high. And his story was, we're the most expensive. We are the most expensive in our category. And he said, sometimes that works out pretty well. And he told the story about being in an accident with his two daughters and his wife at high speed on the Autobahn and leaving the road and crashing into a tree. And nobody was even injured, even scratched, because he was driving an S-Class Mercedes-Benz, and he was very happy that he'd paid that money. So, it depends a little bit on the situation. Do you want to pass a feeling about what it's like to miss out? I mean, these can be very simple stories. I sometimes tell the story of looking in my wardrobe. I don't wear 90% of the clothes and shoes in my wardrobe. I bought them. I've wasted the money on them. I have some favorites that have paid for themselves over and over and over again, right? I wear that jacket so many times, it's nearly falling apart. It was very expensive and it's lasted and I love it. And I think we can all relate to that. We pay more and we get more. Sometimes we pay more and we don't get what we wanted, and that's obviously a disaster. Right. But when you pay more and it's exactly what you needed and you use it and you get good value from it, we never think about that price again. We're very happy that we paid
it. Love it. We talked about a story bank. First question is, what is a story bank and how do we go about creating or developing it?
Yeah, this is something that has been a intellectual question for me for most of my sales management career, because it's not an easy problem. It's not just giving the problem to your marketing department, because I've worked as a marketing manager. It's solving a different problem. Marketing looks at how do we communicate globally, and they also need to use stories. But salespeople have to use stories in conversation, and that's very different from the marketing problem. So what we need to do is not only collect the story, check that it's true, make sure that it's not confidential and that people know how to tell it in a way that doesn't give away confidences, doesn't do harm. We also need to make sure that our salespeople can tell that story. So we actually developed some software to do that. So we have a little app called Anecdotally, which I'll show you what it looks like. But there are many types of software that
helps you develop a story.
I won't show it too closely, but it looks like YouTube. And when you click on the story, it has this concept at the bottom called retells. So we can set tasks in the app. So we say, okay, you're new to sales, and you need to be able to tell these 5 stories. So here they are. You go into the app, you tell the story, and it's recorded as a retell with that story. And then the sales leader goes in and coaches them. And when you can see that story is well told, you can say, okay, I know that person can tell that story. and I can watch and see how they customize that story to their situation. Now that might sound like a bit of effort, but that's so far the only thing that I've discovered that actually works is pretty much I have to be sure that the most important stories, I want to make sure everyone can tell the company story, everyone can tell critical success stories, everyone can tell the value stories. So we could talk about values as well. What do we stand for? What sort of business will we do, and what sort of business will we not do? This is our values. We need to be able to tell those stories as well. So those stories, but most especially success stories, need to be in the story bank, and I need to be sure that my people can tell them. Success stories I call the bread and butter story of storytelling, of sales storytelling, because a well-told success story that is relevant, that is exactly the same problem situation as my prospect, this is the most important story to be able to tell, which we should probably go through an example of, because this is also the hardest story to tell well, because the character stories are built around characters. So I told you a story about, I gave you my connection story. The character in that story is me. I told you a story about one of my clients telling a story to their boss. The character in that story was Diego. The character in a success story is your other client who succeeded. And it's very difficult for salespeople without practice to tell a story from their client's perspective. Salespeople tend to want to brag a bit, and they tend to want to tell a story like, I had this client and we did this for them and we did that, and now I call it the 3-part success story, which goes like this. We had this client, everything was in the shit, we went in and fixed it, and now everything's fantastic. That story doesn't sell, as you can probably imagine, right? Because that story makes your client look like the patsy who can't fix any problems themselves. And it makes you look like a braggart, and I don't believe you, because that story is just not believable. So to be able to tell a story from the perspective of the client is super important. So I give you an example, and then we can kind of maybe break it down. So
Sure.
the way to solve the problem of the sales guy telling a story about themselves and what they sold, they usually end at the sale, by the way, and we sold that thing, which is great because the client didn't get anything. There was no success at the point you signed a contract. What was the outcome? That the success story has to be about the outcome. So I'll tell you about Rebecca. It's not her real name, so we can anonymize success stories. And Rebecca is working for one of the world's largest insurance companies, reinsurance company in Malaysia. She's actually Malaysian. And she got a dream. She really always wanted to work international. And her son she had one son, and he got a university posting in the US. So for the first time, she was able to travel. And she applied for and got the head of sales and marketing, which is called Chief Distribution Officer in insurance companies, in Hong Kong for another very large insurance company. And her territory was all of Asia. And she did what typical first-time sales leaders do, what we do when we're a sales leader, when we've got a new sales team. She got the sales team to present their accounts to her. And she's sitting there listening to her sales team. And she said, oh my gosh, they sound like talking brochures. They sound terrible. I'm going to fail at this role if I can't get these people to relate, to not sound like salespeople. Now, she had done a sales training course with my company, with Anecdote, a couple of years before, and she reached out to us, and she called me actually. It was just at the start of COVID, and she said, I want to do a storytelling course for my team. And I said, I didn't say sure, here's the price. I said, what's happened? What's happened to make you want to do a storytelling course? That's a story listening question, by the way, which we should talk about if we have time. What's happened to make you do that? And she told me that story I've just told you now. I've got this new job. I've got them to present to me. They sounded like talking brochures. And I said, well, I can't do a face-to-face training, COVID, but we've just built a virtual version of this course. I could deliver it virtually to your team. And she was very skeptical, as I was actually, very skeptical about how it would work virtually, but we had no choice. And she sorry, just 1 second, Mustafa.
Sure. So gang, if what you
sorry about that, I just got interrupted. I'm back.
No worries.
So anyway, so back to the story. So so she told me that story, and I explained we'd do a virtual, and she agreed to do the virtual. One of our first clients to do our virtual storytelling program, and we did the program, and we got to this. We built a story bank for her team, and she called me about 2 months after the training, and she said, "Mike, it's working. I've got everyone back in the office. They're all in the open area. They all got their masks on, and one of the pushy guys, was starting to do the old push the sales pitch, and the woman next to him elbowed him and said, 'Hey, tell a story.'" And he was on the phone, said, "Tell a story." So the team, the reason it was working was the team was starting to coach each other. They're starting to share stories and coach each other and stop the push and pitch. So, and Rebecca, by the way, she went back to her old company. So she did very well. She was the only sales team in her new company to hit their target globally through COVID, because it was a big drop in business. People stopped spending money. But then she went back to her old company, which is also a major company, and she's now the CEO of that company globally. So it's nice to finish with a personal success. So if I trace you through that story, it was about Rebecca. It wasn't about me. I was just in there to help. It was about her problem. I let you visualize her problem. We came up with a plan, which was to deliver a program virtually. She didn't like the idea. She didn't have much choice, but we overcame that, and she achieved success. I told you what her success was. She actually she had the best performing sales team in all of her company, and she had personal success. So we want to focus on what was the outcome for the client.
Got it. Love it. Love those stories. So, Mike, what is a good story type to open a sales meeting with? Like your first meeting with a client, you want to open up the conversation, you want to paint a picture, and you want to establish rapport, credibility, expertise, and the rest of it. What type of stories should we use to open the meeting with?
There isn't a fixed answer to that question. It's really quite situational. If I'm meeting someone for the very first time, we don't know each other. The most important thing is that we get to know each other. That's more important. Actually, this is something that's done better in Asia than in North America. The most important thing is we get to know each other. So in Asia, you'll spend a lot of time getting to know each other before you talk business. In North America, you get down to business. By sharing a story about who you are and why you do what you do, connection story, and if in that story you also demonstrate your love, your connection to your business, to your market, if you can tell a short story, 1.5 minutes is a good target time, less than 2 minutes, and if you can say, "What about you? How did you get into your job?" You're very likely to find that your 30-minute meeting becomes 1 hour or 90 minutes, because you've started sharing stories and people forget about time.
Becomes more interesting. Yeah.
So in that sort of special situation, you just don't know each other. But quite often you do know the other people, or, look, many of my clients, they're big corporations and they work again and again with the same clients, right? So you do know that person. So you might lead in that case with, I heard or I read that you're working with this particular challenge. The challenges are often quite well known as well. Could I tell you a story about one of our other clients that's just been through that? And of course they're interested. And then you tell a success story. So quite often the success story is a good way to get started in a meeting as well. But, value stories can be super interesting as well. And since we have a little bit of time, maybe I should just quickly explain a value story. So
yeah.
How you behave and what you stand for is super important. And it can be just lip service to a value, or it can be real. and the client has no way to tell. So the best example is sustainability. Sustainability is my least favorite word because it actually means nothing on its own. It has no meaning. So I'll give you an example. The client says something abstract. We believe in sustainable business. What does that mean? Who the hell knows? I've no idea what that means. Something nice, I suppose. The sales guy responds with their pre-prepared greenwashing PowerPoint deck. Oh, we're very green. We have this green thing and that green thing, blah, 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 blah. We're green, right? When you do that as a salesperson, you have no idea what the client meant by the word sustainable, and you respond with what you think they meant. You're normally running at a massive disconnect.
Mm-hmm.
Salespeople do this all the time. So you need to know about story listening question. The customer says, we believe in sustainable business. And you go, so do we. But for my curiosity, could you give me an example of sustainability in action in your company? And then the client will tell you that they're not actually concerned about the heat death of our sun and moving the earth further away or closer to the sun as the sun dies. Their concept of sustainability is something a little bit more local, like, say, packaging, right? So they talk about how they managed to reduce their packaging, and now you know what they mean by sustainable, not talking about the heat death of the sun. Good. You can now talk about packaging and what you've been doing with that, right? So asking the story listening question and then giving an example. So we are firm believers in sustainable business. For example, we recently introduced this system. That's a value story. That's one of our values, is looking after the planet. So you tell a story. By just saying the high-level abstract thing, sustainability, you're not saying anything at all. By giving a concrete example in a story, you're understood. We know what you mean by sustainable. We know what we're talking about. We can now share a conversation around values. Most salespeople don't talk about values of transparency and honesty, for example. And when you do, it's very, very powerful. I'll give you one more quick example. I heard it from a sales guy. At our company, we believe in doing the right thing by our customer, no matter what. For example, last month, our CEO was signing a reseller agreement. So we put lots of technology, software technology in our solution. He was the systems integrator. And in the reseller agreement, the CEO was just going through with a pen and initialing the various clauses. And he got to the clause that said that our company will get a 10% commission on any of this software product that we put into another client. And our CEO crossed that clause out, looked up at me and said, we don't take commissions or kickbacks from our suppliers because that could be a conflict of interest with our client. We want our client to know that the only way we get paid is from them. That's a fabulous value story. And it tells you, so you say, we believe look, we believe in being totally transparent about how we operate. For example, and you tell that story. Those conversations could well be the right conversation to have right at the beginning. Look, I want you to know that we only operate in an ethical way, and you tell a story. So that's why I say, Mustafa, there's many answers to your question. You've got to be alive to what the context is and what the situation is. Yeah.
For sure. We talked about sharing a gift. Tell us about your gift and what you're sharing with people.
Yeah, look, there's many ways to learn these techniques. You can buy my book, and that's a very cheap way actually to learn. Buying and reading books is a fabulous way to learn. That's how I've mostly learned about sales and sales training myself. But I've also put together a lot of videos on the different types of stories. So you'll share the link. So you can go in, you can say, I want to know more about success stories. You can just do a search in that YouTube channel. You'll find success stories, and you'll see good examples, and you can have a practice yourself. So yeah, I encourage everyone to do that, because the way to learn storytelling is to immerse yourself in stories. And I've tried as hard as I can in our session, Mustafa, is to give you lots of stories as examples, because that is the way to learn as well, is just to notice stories, have a go at telling them, but really listen out for them. Notice the best salespeople. Notice, by the way, the best salespeople in most companies is often not in the sales department. It's usually the founder or the CEO or maybe your chief operating officer. They're very often very good salespeople. So notice the stories that they tell.
Love it. So, gang, to learn more about the stories and to get more tips and strategies on sharing and telling stories, go and visit and check Mike's YouTube channel. The handle on YouTube is The Story Leader. And if you search for Mike Adams, his videos will show up on YouTube. If you're listening to this later and you want to check out Mike's channel and get more tips from him, go search on YouTube for Mike Adams, or the handle again is The Story Leader. So as we're approaching towards the end of our time here, Mike, and I know you have to run, you have a hard stop. Give us a 30-second simple marketing strategy that people can do and try in less than 10 minutes and see results and experience, hopefully, a big difference and a big change.
Marketing strategy or sales strategy?
Marketing strategy. Sales, something quick and dirty and to the point. Where like, try this one thing, maybe even about stories.
Well, one thing that marketing and salespeople can do is whenever you get your team together, make it a practice that someone has to bring a story to that meeting and start your meeting with that story. So you'll say, okay, next meeting, you're going to come with a success story. I know you've just won that deal. I want to hear the story of how we won and what the client's getting out. I want to know about the implementation. Bring that story, less than 3 minutes. And if you do that, if you start every meeting with a story, and you can change the types of stories that you're going to, next meeting, I want you to tell the company story and we're going to talk about it for 10 minutes. You will find that the conversation style will change for your sales team.
Oh, yeah.
All right. Next meeting, I want to hear what happened when you tell this story to a client. Come back and tell me what happened, because tell me the story of what happened. So that's a very simple change that sales leaders and marketing leaders can make with their team.
Love it. One thing that I've done myself is throughout the day and throughout the week, if something happens during the day, especially a challenge or an issue that we deal with, if I'm aware, I quickly turn it into a story and make a post, either email it to my list, post it on social media. I'd be like, here is a challenge and a thing that we experienced today. Either there's a solution or resolution to that challenge, or here's just what I'm experiencing as a human being, as a business owner. And when we started doing that, the response rate to our posts and to emails went up significantly, because it's just a lot more engaging versus I'm awesome, buy my shit. It just
it's funny that, isn't it?
Yeah. And I think we got stories throughout the day, and that's what I noticed. Like, every day there is a story, there is a challenge, either with a customer, internally, externally. And I know we're kind of running out of. Can you give us a 1 minute rundown on objections to that? Because I know a lot of people are like, oh, nobody cares about that. Who cares about my challenge?
Yeah, I hear this quite often. I hear that but people don't have time for stories, and I have different ways to respond to that. But I talked right at the beginning about a business story. A business story has to be relevant, and you can't just start telling a story to a senior business leader without them understanding why you're telling the story. So you need that relevant statement. I want to make a point about the importance of doing a trial before we implement this system. And then you will tell them about another client who didn't do a trial and all went wrong. So relevance is very important. The other story I have several stories where the client told me, you got 10 minutes and the meeting went 90 minutes. There's normal business time and there's story time. So normal business time is blah, 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 give me the facts. And then story time is, that happened to me too. And it was like this. And suddenly no one is looking at the time. What you want is more time with your client. And the way to get more time with your client is to be sharing stories. hearing their
Yeah.
story, telling yours. And this is actually, in my view, the only way to really get more time with the client is to be sharing stories, because they suddenly don't care about time. They're learning and they're really understanding you and they're getting it.
I mean, it's a lot more engaging to hear a story, especially if it's crafted and designed well to engage versus, oh, this thing is, just talk, just bragging about how awesome our product or service
Yeah.
is. So, running out of time here, we only have 3 minutes left. Let me ask you some quick personal questions, then we're going to wrap this up. That be okay?
Go for it.
All right. What's a new thing that you have tried recently, big or small? As small as a cup of something new, or as big as going to the moon?
Well, I recently bought a boat and everything is new and everything doesn't work like it should work. So I've been teaching myself all sorts of new things to make my boat work, from mechanics to electronics to whatever. So I have no shortage of new things.
Good.
But in business, building an app to share stories in and doing that, it's also been new and very interesting and has tremendous potential, I think.
Love it. Love it. Give me 2 of your favorite books of all time.
Business books?
Business, personal.
My favorite.
Some that maybe you recommended all time.
I'll give you 2. I'll give you one from
Okay.
personal life and one. So my favorite business sales related book is by a guy called Mahan Khalsa and Randy Illig, and the book is called Let's Get Real or Let's Not Play, and it's a classic of how to be the right kind of person that can really help your client. So I highly recommend that to all salespeople. Brilliant book. My all-time favorite book, nonfiction book, is a philosophical scientific book called The Beginning of Infinity, and the author is David Deutsch. He's the Clarendon Professor of Quantum Mechanics at Oxford University, so he's a pretty smart guy. But it's about how problems are inevitable and problems are solvable. If you have a problem and its solution doesn't involve breaking one of the laws of physics, like going faster than the speed of light, your problem is solvable. And if you put your effort to solving it, you probably can solve it. And all of our problems are solvable. And whenever we create a solution to a problem, guess what? We create more problems, which is fine. We're still making progress. So the beginning of infinity is a pointer to the fact that we have potential for infinite progress. We'll never solve all our problems. There is no utopia, but problems are solvable. And that's a brilliant book. It's not the easiest going, but it's a brilliant book.
Love it. Last question, Mike. What's one advice that made a big impact in your life or business?
It's incredibly useful to have people believe in you when you don't believe in yourself. That first happened to, I used to be a competitive sailor. I used to race sailboats, and I remember the best sailor, saying that they thought I was going to be a good sailor. And that's incredibly powerful. And what that means is that you can pay that forward. You can notice other young people and say, I think you're going to be really good at this. It's so powerful to have recognition to other people. And I try to remember to do that. You've got a new salesperson and you can see their potential. You can see what they're good at. And you focus on that. I can see you're really good at that. I think you're going to be really good at this. It's really motivating. So yeah, that could be one thing.
Beautiful. Mike, thank you very much. This has been a very interesting conversation. Gang, go on Mike's YouTube channel, The Story Leader. Check out his videos, reach out to him, ask for help, and ask for maybe consultation and advice on making your sales and marketing conversations more interesting and more engaging by the use of stories. I've tried it. I've tested it. It works. It is amazing. It's awesome. It's less salesy, less pushy, less fearful. You don't have to think. more fun, and you don't have to think about a lot about what you have to say because you got stories and people love it. Mike, is there any last second thing you want to mention that maybe we didn't before we wrap up?
No, look, I would just like to reach out to your audience and tell them that if they got this far, congratulations. You're in a brilliant profession. You know, it's just a fantastic thing to do. So do it honorably. Tell the truth. Tell true stories. Don't make out a story that was someone else's story. Make out that it happened to you or anything. That you don't need to do that. You can be really successful in an ethical, honest way of doing business. So I wish you all well.
Beautiful. Thank you, Mike. Hope you have a great rest of your day. Thank you for joining us. You've been listening to the Simple Marketing Podcast. My name is Mustafa Hosseini, and we'll see you in our next episode. Bye now.